Good afternoon, everybody. I'll tell you another story from when I was a kid. This is another story about a teacher that I had in school. She's long deceased now, so I can tell this story anyway. She was my grade 1 teacher, and her name was Mrs. Merkley. And now in kindergarten, we had a teacher by the name of Mrs. Fortner. And Mrs. Fortner was like everybody's favorite old aunt or whatever, just a very kind-hearted person. Anyway, really nice person. Treated us really well and was just really good to us. And we were good in her class because we never wanted to disappoint Mrs. Fortner. We had so much respect for her, We never wanted to do anything to upset her or to disappoint her. Anyway, in grade 1, the first day of grade 1, of course, we ended up in Mrs. Merkley's classroom. And she was one of those teachers, she would talk with that kind of hard to explain, that nasally sort of a thing, I'm Mrs. Merkley. Mrs. Merkley. That's how she sounded, Mrs. Merkley. Anyway, Mrs. Merkley, she was an older woman at that time, although I don't think she was as old as she appeared, really. A lot of people back then aged fairly quickly. People in their 40s and 50s looked oftentimes the way people in their 70s do now. Anyway, Mrs. Merkley, she introduced herself to us the first day when she got us sitting down in the classroom. She says, I'm Mrs. Merkley, and this is the strap. And then she just went whomp, and smacked the strap, just brought the strap down on the top of her desk. So that was my first experience with Mrs. Merkley. That was our first experience with Mrs. Merkley. And Mrs. Merkley wasn't all bad, that's for sure. And years later, when I was working for the school board, actually, and I did custodial work for the school board after I was an adult, she was still there, but she was only on half days. And she was always very kind to me at that point. And the poor thing ended up having a series of strokes anyway after that. That's what finished her anyway. She just had strokes and just gradually died that way, So it was kind of a miserable way for a person to die, really. But she was semi-retired and working half days when I did custodial work for the separate school board back in 1988. I was just an on-call custodian. I just came to wherever I was needed within the board to fill in, and there were times I was back at my old school. And Mrs. Merkley had an unfortunate experience. Her husband was a farmer, and he had come in to have his lunch one afternoon, and this was around the time that I was in grade 1, right around that era, And he came in to have his lunch, and I guess he choked on something, and he died, and she came home from school, and she found him in the kitchen. He had passed away, So that's a pretty tough thing, It's an awful thing for anybody to have to deal with. But Mrs. Merkley was very old school, and like a lot of people back then, you didn't fool around with her. And there's something going on in the woods. Anyway, excuse me. Wasn't a good one to fool around with anyway, and very strict and very precise in what she expected from us. And if you disobeyed her in any way, the consequences were severe. She would hit you. She'd strap you or whatever. In fact, one of the things she used to do is she'd come up behind us. You'd hear her walking up the aisle behind you, and you weren't allowed to turn around and look behind you. You were always to have your eyes front. That's how it was. But she used to say that, eyes front, and you had to always be looking ahead. You'd never turn around or you'd be in trouble. And anyway, you'd hear her walking up behind you, up the aisle behind you, and you'd never know what was going to happen. Maybe she was just walking to the front of the room, or maybe she was going to bring the strap down across the back of your neck, because that's something she used to do. If she decided that you hadn't done just what you were supposed to do or whatever, that could happen. And she used to also have a ruler, and in those days rulers had a metal edge on them for drawing lines, a heavy wooden ruler with this metal edge sticking out of the edge of it. And that thing was sharp, and she'd hit you on your knuckles with that until your knuckles were running blood. If that was another thing she'd do. Anyway, needless to say, back then, I didn't really like her very much. Most of us didn't. But the other thing she would do too is she'd do the Catholic equivalent of a dunce cap, which was she'd make you stand in the garbage can, make you stand in the wastebasket. And she would say, if you're going to act like garbage, then that's where you belong. So you can go and stand there, in the wastebasket with the rest of the garbage. Yeah, I got that treatment a few times and got the strap across the back of the neck and my knuckles bloodied and hauled up to the front of the room and strapped on my hands and things like that, And it didn't take very much, the slightest little thing. You turn your head and look out the window, you were liable to get hit. That's just how it was in those days. Anyway, it ended up that I got the idea, because I really didn't like Mrs. Merkley, and I got the idea, and this was wrong of me. Let me say that up front. This was wrong of me. I'm going to tell the story, and I think it's funny that I did this now, but I also think it was wrong. I know I shouldn't have done it, but still, it was kind of funny, and that's why I'm going to tell the story. In the boiler room at school, there were often dead mice and dead rats and everything, There was poison put down for them. And, anyway, I got the idea that I gaffle onto a sardine tin. We didn't eat sardines, but where we lived, everybody threw their garbage in one area. It was a big kind of a wooden shack where all the garbage went. And it was my job, actually, to take our garbage out. I used to have to walk down there with the garbage and throw it in there. And I got the idea that I would steal a sardine can out of a neighbor's garbage, because there were neighbors that ate sardines. We didn't, but there were some. So I gaffled onto a sardine can. I went through the garbage in there, and I found a sardine can. And, of course, with them, they have they're a flat rectangular thing, and they have a lid that folds back. You just peel the lid back to get the contents out of it, to get the sardines. Excuse me, sinuses. So what I did was I stole a sardine can. I managed to get into my dad's tools, and I stole some nails, just some small nails out of my dad's toolbox. And the next day, I snuck into the boiler room. There was a door just off, where we had to walk past to get to the schoolyard after we got off the bus at school. I went in there and I stole a dead mouse. I found a dead mouse in there. It was pretty much guaranteed to always find dead mice in there. I stole that. And of course, I had my nails and everything. I didn't have a hammer, but we used to wear these heavy leather Buster Brown shoes. And they had a wicked hard rubber sole on them. It was a really solid sole these shoes had on them. And it made a great thing if you had to beat something into something or whatever. It was pretty good. You could use your shoe as a hammer, basically. So, I snuck into the school with my dead mouse and my sardine tin and my stolen nails and my shoes, with my shoes on. Got into the classroom before anybody was around in there. I took an awful chance, because if I'd gotten caught, I'd have been in a world of trouble. But I put the mouse into the sardine tin, and of course I had the lid of it folded up away out of the sardine tin. And what I did is, I didn't put the mouse in right away, no, but I did have the mouse there. I nailed the nails up through the lid into the bottom of her wooden desk, right up under where the drawers were and stuff. I put it right in there. And I took off one of my shoes, and I used it as a hammer. And of course, every time I hit the nail, I put a couple of nails in it. Every time I hit a nail, of course, it did bang, and I was afraid I was going to get caught, but I managed to do it and not get caught. Nobody came or anything. But every time I did that, I just cringed, and then I'd wait a few seconds before I'd hit it again and stuff. Anyway, then I put the mouse into the tin, and I just folded the tin up under the desk, because the lid was attached on one end. The lid would just peel back on those things. If you've ever seen a sardine tin, that's how they are. Anyway, so I did that, and I did that, left it up there. Well, of course, it stunk real bad, and she couldn't get near her desk. And they even had a plumber come in and take the pipes apart under the sink at the back of the room, because they thought maybe something was rotten in the trap or whatever in the pipes. So anyway, fast forward from 1974, when I did this, to 1987. Now, I've already told you about my old friend Tom Kerr. He was one of the custodians at the school, and he had taken me under his wing and helped me quite a bit after I had been used as a guinea pig for drugs and stuff, and I was in bad health because of it, and so on. Well, Tom Kerr, I was over at his house. I was 19 years old in 1987. I was over at Tom Kerr's house, and his grandson Ben, who was only 6 years old at the time, was also there. Ben was kind of a wild-going kid, You never knew what Ben might do. And I guess Ben had gotten into some trouble in Mrs. Merkley's class, because she was still working, And she couldn't hit you anymore, but what she'd do is she'd keep the kids in for detention, because she could do that, So she ordered Ben to stay in at recess time anyway to serve a detention for something he had done. And she left him alone in the classroom. She went off somewhere and left him there by himself. And he was complaining about her. He was mad. He didn't think it was right. He thought that it was an injustice that he should have to serve this detention, and he was really mad at her for doing that. Chances are he'd done something to deserve it, but he didn't see it that way anyway. He was pretty upset about it. And who knows, really, I don't know what the circumstances were, but he wasn't happy, and he was complaining about her. And then he says, and she's weird. She left me alone in the classroom, and I got poking around her desk, and she's got a can nailed up under her desk. Got a can up there stuck up under her desk, and it looks really old and it stinks, he said. I don't think he actually said nailed up. That's me adding, because I know I nailed it up, but either stuck up or nailed up or something. I can't remember now, but anyway, and he said it stinks. Well, when he said that, I said, was it a sardine tin? And he says, oh, I don't know. Well, it was a sardine tin. I described it to him, a flat, rectangular kind of a can. And he said, yeah, that's what it looked like. And I said, well, if you had pulled that down, you'd have found a little mouse skeleton in there. And I told him the story anyway. And of course, Tom Kerr was sitting there listening to all this. And he got mad. He says, you bugger, do you have any idea the trouble that caused me? They gave me an awful hard time over that. And it was him that told me that they brought a plumber in to take the pipes apart. I didn't know that, but they'd done that. And, yeah. So it was quite a while there where she couldn't get anywhere near her desk because of the smell in that corner of the room, Anyway, that's just the story of one of my misadventures, one of my many crimes that I committed when I was a kid. And like I say, don't do this at home or school. This isn't a how-to guide for kids as to how they can repay their teacher they don't like. But anyway, it's just kind of an old story from the past. It's something that I did when I was a little boy, and it was kind of neat anyway to hear that the tin was still up there and it even still stunk. Of course, I'm thinking he must have had his nose pretty close to it if he was up under there. But still, I think that's pretty good workmanship. I was kind of proud of myself. The fact that it had stayed up there and it even still had a stink to it. But, yeah. Anyway. I know I shouldn't be proud of it, but I kind of am. You know? I shouldn't be, though. Anyway, that's the story. Maybe I shouldn't have done it, but I did, and it is what it is. Yeah. Anyway, Rocky's around here somewhere. I don't know where he is right now, but he might be inside having a sleep again. I don't know. He's been sleeping a lot today. Anyway, I'll talk to you all later.